Welcome back to the Feminine Manifesto podcast. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Matt Cliff. Matt is the CEO of Cherish Queensland, one of the largest pro-life organisations in Australia. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Brisbane School of Theology. He grew up in England and served as the senior pastor of a Baptist church just outside of London. He has a bachelor's degree in theology, a master's in theological research, and is a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen focusing on abortion. So welcome to the Feminine Manifesto podcast, Matt. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the privilege.
Can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, what it was like growing up in England, why your accent sounds a bit Scottish, Irish, and what your life currently looks like?
Yeah, so I'm from northwest of England, so a little town just outside of Liverpool. We don't all speak like the Queen, Heather, in England, so there's definitely some other accents. So I've got one of these strange accents, but yeah, often I get, am I Irish or Scottish? That's not true. I am British. Well, I'm English. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I became a believer really probably around 24, or got serious in my faith, however you want to look at it, around 24. And I straight away had this burning desire to study, and that's led me down to London, where I did my bachelor's degree, ended up doing my master's and pastoring. And yeah, how I ended up over in Australia is I married an Aussie from Ipswich in Australia, not in England. Yeah, that was my wife, Mel, and we moved over in 2022.
Yes, well, that'll do it, getting married over here. You wear quite a few different hats. You run a pro-life organisation, you're a lecturer, a PhD candidate, and you also seek to actively equip, support, and strengthen church leaders and congregations in Christian ethics and apologetics. It's quite a broad range of things that you're involved here with. What motivates you to be involved in each of these areas?
Yeah, I think what underpins all of my vocational stuff really is my heart just to serve the local church. Like I love the church. Obviously being a pastor as well, I'm empathetic with leaders. And there was just, yeah, I feel a certain calling that God's put on my life to look into these subjects that are not necessarily not the most popular, but they're probably the least spoken about. But I think a lot of the touching points with culture, for example, Christian ethics, now I think is going to be, if not already, a major point where church leaders need to be educated in terms of navigating the complexity of this culture.
Yep.
So yeah, all of my vocational stuff, my lecturing, my PhD, my pro-life work really comes from a heart of just wanting to help churches and the church generally just grow, really.
Who would you say, or has there been something in your life that's made you become so active in these causes?
Yeah, I had an interesting event. I was looking for a subject to do my master's degree on, and was thinking about doing a New Testament study, something about regarding faith and Paul, that type of thing. And I was studying a supermarket one day in London, and I just looked to my left and I saw a newspaper article that was talking about how the Midwives Union at the time and the largest abortion provider in the UK was an organisation called BPAS, British Pregnancy Advisory Service. What had happened was the chair of the Midwives Union was also the CEO or something like that of BPAS, and she was trying to get the union to sign something up. Anyway, massive conflict of interest. I remember picking that up and thinking, wow, this is crazy. I found out that it's actually not too crazy, like at the moment, considering my work. But at the time, I was like, well, this is, a new paradigm shift for me. I thought, what a conflict of interest. And it was in that moment that I was reading that article that the Lord really placed on my heart the question of where's the church in this? Where's the church? Where's the kind of prophetic voice in our culture speaking on this issue of abortion? Because at that point, I'd never really heard abortion really mentioned in my church, in my kind of church circles. So it was kind of a wake up moment for me. And that's why I decided from that moment to do my master's degree on the subject. And it kind of, again, just pulled me into this crazy world that I'm in now.
Yeah, for sure. Would you say the abortion issue is similar in Australia as it is in the UK? A similar sort of cultural perception of it all?
Definitely. I think in the US, it's a completely different beast. The that's largely because you have a cultural consensus of evangelicals there. I
Yep.
think last time I checked, it was like 25% of Americans would say they're evangelical Christians.
Mm.
That's not necessarily the same in the UK and Australia. And that's not
Yep.
to say that Australia and UK don't have a lot of Christians in their nation. It's just that they haven't reached a consensus position on this issue as they have in the US.
Interesting. So you're currently a PhD candidate researching the topic of abortion. This is a massive topic, huge topic, encompassing many aspects. What is your PhD about? What are you focusing on, and why did you choose to do it?
Yeah, so first and foremost, in my master's degree, my question was, is there a silence with regards to the contemporary evangelical church in the UK on the issue of abortion? And I wanted
Hmm.
in my master's just to see, is there a silence or is this just my perception to prove that? And that was an empirical research paper. I think I succeeded in proving that actually there is a silence. I'll give you an example of that.
Okay.
In 2011, I think it was, the Evangelical Alliance, which is the largest group of evangelicals in the UK. Um, they basically did a research project and asked church leaders, for example, in terms of the political issues, what was the top political issues in the country at the time, and abortion was 25th on that list,
Yeah, well.
alongside climate change. So, there's a massive, that's 15th, not 25th, 15th, sorry, but still a lot. And yeah, so that was kind of a key result in terms of, look, there is a silence on this. The church isn't speaking on it. And
Yep.
yeah, my master's, coming to my PhD now, long story short, is trying to figure out why there is a silence. So
Hmm.
I proved that there is. My master's my PhD is trying to look at why there is this silence. So that's where I'm at.
Okay. And can you give us any tips on what you found out so far?
Yeah, obviously still going through it. I don't complete until hopefully next year by God's grace. But one of the key things that keeps coming across to me is in the literature in the UK specifically, because that's the area I'm looking at. All the Christians that I've written on abortion would have a kind of generally a consensus issue on kind of what is the unborn, the issue of personhood, actually what is an abortion. There will be some
Hmm.
nuances there and some differences, but generally all evangelicals would land the same on that. And I find that similar when I speak to pastors now. Most pastors I speak to, if not all, would all say they're pro-life.
Yep.
The issue, Heather, this is what I'm finding in my PhD so far, is that if I was to ask the same five pastors in the room, or if I was to look at the literature in terms of how you engage on the issue of abortion, they're all over the map.
Yep.
All the responses to that question are all different.
Hmm.
And I think that's the root cause of why we're not achieving the impact in society that we have, because we've got no alignment on cultural consensus and strategy.
Yep. Yeah. That's really interesting. And I think possibly part of that is to do because abortion is held up to be a political issue.
Mm.
So a lot of Christians start to get uneasy when politics enter the church. So what's your response to people who say Jesus didn't call us to be political, he called us to preach the
Mm.
gospel, and Christians, we shouldn't be involved in politics?
Yeah. There's two big fears with that question. The first one is when people say, oh, we shouldn't get involved in politics. Well, the big critique of that is Jesus was political. To say Jesus is king is a massively political statement. And it was then,
Mm.
even in his own society. What a lot of people hear, and this is a lot of fear that I get, even from church leaders who lead big denominations, is when I say, oh, Christians need to be involved in politics, what they hear sometimes incorrectly is, oh, Christians need to be partisan, meaning you have to back a certain party. And
Hmm.
that's not true. I would never advocate for a church leader per se to join a certain political party. What I would say to church leaders is that you need to be issue based. So, for example, abortion is a political issue. Well, it's not actually. Primarily, it's a theological issue with political
Yeah.
implications. That's different. Um, So what they hear, one of the fears is, oh, we've got to be partisan. For example, we've got to either back the LNP or we've got to back Labour or One Nation or whatever. The issue with that is for them is that a lot of their congregation would be divided on that. Therefore, it becomes a
Yeah.
divisive issue. But I just say, forget that. Forget party. What you need to do is be issue focused. So that's one issue. And then the next issue is all completely about the church and state in terms of how involved churches need to get. Are we trying to just make the nation Christian? Well, to some extent, again, there is a divide. We know between Jesus says this in render to Caesar what's to Caesar and give to God what is to God. So we know there is a separation there, but we also have the opportunity to influence culture, and influence politics is part of culture. So the mandate to be salt and light still applies to the political realm.
That's really helpful. I think in thinking of it as influencing culture is so important and a helpful way to think about it, because as Christians, we should definitely be involved in that. And particularly when our culture is talking about killing the unborn, killing innocent life, going directly against how God has commanded us to live.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
And I think when people get upset when you say be involved in politics, there can be a lack of understanding what being political means. I think people can tend to go to think of the worst protests that they've seen and then think, that's just going to be violent, that's not helpful. But being involved in politics could simply mean contacting your local MP regularly, having a relationship with them and influencing them, which we should be doing as Christians, for sure.
All Christians are involved in politics. I'll give you an example.
Yep.
In Australia specifically, you all have to vote. To vote is involvement in politics. So at some level, you're going to be involved. The question is, at what level do you want to get involved? So that's the issue.
And I think in Australia, when you contrast it to America, where they are generally more outspoken on things, politics and political views can often be very personal for many people here, for many Australians. And you've mentioned to me previously about one of your aims to trying to unify the Christian vote. So when you look at the current Australian political landscape, where Liberals have historically been the Conservative Party, but I think too many Australians have turned into more of a slightly conservative Labor Party. Now you have the rise of One Nation. What are your thoughts is there a certain party that we should be getting behind to try and unify Christians, particularly at this stage of our societal life?
So I'm always clear in terms of Cherish Life as an organization, we actually don't promote a certain particular party. What we do is promote candidates who stand for the issues that we put forward. And that's an important distinction. So for us, like, again, we have no favorites basically. And I think what I'm trying to do is say, look, again, just pragmatically, I typed in not too long ago in ChatGPT, which is obviously the fount of all knowledge and wisdom. I typed in how many Christians are in Queensland, and the answer I got was 2.5 million. Right. Now I was like shocked at that. I was thinking, what? Now does that mean the 2.5 million are born again, proper going church going Christians? No.
Yep. But
let's just say, okay, let's say 1 million or even 500,000 of them are church-going folk or have a Judeo-Christian worldview, for example, a solid. That then becomes the largest voting bloc in the state.
Yeah, wow.
So the largest union in the state right now, I could be wrong again, I need to do my research properly, but is around 150,000 people. The teachers' union, in my understanding, is around 80,000. Now, let me tell you, these unions have a lot of power in the state. But again, goes back to the Christian consensus there. Let's say it's 500,000. It is phenomenally bigger than all of them.
Yeah.
So it goes back to my PhD point. The fact, if we can reach a consensus and a consensus on strategy, and that could be as simple as, look, when it comes to election time, this issue of abortion is number one. And that's not to say the other issues are not important, but there's a sense of immediacy with this issue. These are children getting killed in the womb. So there's an immediate impact that we need to have, I think, straight away. So yeah, that would be my lean in to be, look, we can actually be very effective if we can reach some sort of consensus.
So how is that going to play out, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, look, we started, for example, we've already started that process. Like in 2024, I led the Cherish Life to lead the campaign to, get politicians elected and things like that. And obviously, what happened there with the LNP, basically, somewhat betraying us, if I can say it bluntly. So then I was like, okay, how do we move forward here? What I did, I got all the biggest Christian organizations in Queensland together in a room. I said, look, we've got to align here on mission. We've got to demonstrate this first and foremost. And our job very simply now is to align our messaging together. And so that when people on the pew or even church leaders say, look, we're trying to get some authoritative voice from a Christian perspective here, not necessarily a party perspective on where we should be voting. And we want to be that voice, very simply because we're in that sphere 24/7. Well, not 24/7, but pretty much 9 to 5. Do you know what I mean? Every day of the week. So I think we have a fantastic grasp on what's going on politically from a Christian perspective in Queensland.
Yep.
So, the more I've just launched a program called Be Their Voice. And what I'm asking church leaders to do is, for $99 a month, that's how you can help us financially. But what we want from you guys is, or what we'll provide for you guys is obviously our educational resources, access to myself, coming and doing talks, etc. But also, come election time, to be able to say, look, this is where we feel you need to be looking in terms of a candidate to back, not a party, a candidate. And this is where we need your help praying for your electorate. So we're in the process of making that happen.
On the candidate issue, because my thoughts around when I'm voting and when I'm choosing who to vote for is that if I'm just looking at individual candidates, then they might be good, but if they don't have the power of, if they don't have any balance of power because there's only one of them in there, then how useful is that really going to be in Parliament?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I think that's a really, that's a big critique of the minor party strategy, to be honest. If you're backing a minor party, for example, well, that might only be one vote, for example. And, you've got to play the long game with the LNP, et cetera, get the people in there. There's a certain sense of truth in that. My job, again, though, is just to provide the best candidates that are pro-life and to educate you guys to vote that way. If you decide to say, okay, even though that guy's pro-life, I don't think he's going to achieve much, that's your conscience. Therefore, I'm going to try and, again, vote for whoever it'll be on the majors and try and get some influence that way. Again, that's your prerogative, and that's the Queensland voters' prerogative. My job is just to get the best pro-life candidates available. And I would also say, there is a lot that even one candidate can achieve. I'll give you an example. In WA, there's a party called the Australian Christian Party, which is Marika. Now, she's only one person in there. But what Marika can do is constantly just put bills through to get discussed or bring issues to the forefront, because she has a right to bring stuff to the Parliament floor. And what that does is it then at least we get talking about abortion, and we get why that's helpful for us is we can gain more knowledge out of that conversation, and obviously more knowledge to inform the voter. Even look, the major party strategy is an option. The minor party strategy is also an option. It just depends on, your view of the landscape of the political sphere.
Yeah, I think another hang up that Christians can have with pro-life, maybe not some pro-life groups, but Christian parties who are focusing solely on this issue is that it can come across sometimes that they haven't thought past this issue. So I'm 100% pro-life. I've been giving pro-life speeches to whoever I could since I was in high school. But I do struggle to get behind movements that are solely focused on this issue, because when I'm looking at our culture and looking at feminism, that's what I'm sort of trying to tackle in my podcast, is I see there's a much deeper issue here. So abortion is the tip of the iceberg, which I feel if we cut that off, praise God, so many babies saved. However, all the other underlying issues that even if abortion was outlawed, these issues still exist that caused abortion to even flourish in the first place. So, how would you advise people to think through these issues? How do we pursue truth, goodness, and morality based on the Bible, but also pursue good policies regarding
Mm.
infrastructure, building up our economy, and so forth? Yeah, how do we sort of think
It's a
through
good
that?
question. Look, I think it's a both and, not an either or. I think we should
Yep.
absolutely, whilst I mean, we do that, Cherish. Like we also do, educate people around the broader cultural issue of why we've got to this stage with abortion. Um, as you mentioned, the rise of feminism,
Hmm.
for example, is one thing. Individualism, all these different things. So we do that. Um, but again, I think it goes back to my point in terms of
Hmm.
immediacy as well. Like the policy goal for us is to save as many lives as we can, young babies as we can. Now, the educational goal for us,
Yep.
of course, is to speak into the ideologies that have captured these institutions, these political parties, these people, these individuals that have led them to have the perspective that they have. That's the root of the issue, absolutely. And again, we do
Hmm.
both. It's not an either or for us.
That's helpful. I heard you speak at the pro life protest in Brisbane a few weeks ago, and I really appreciate how you tied the truth of the gospel to it. And I can't help but see somewhat grieve when pro life movements and any
Mm.
movement in the name of Christianity seeks to remove or soften the gospel in what they do, because when we do this, we become powerless. So, how do you seek to install the gospel into what you do?
Yeah. Well, when I do my educational talks, the gospel is at the start of my talk. Because what
Hmm.
needs to happen is when I go and speak in churches or anywhere really, inevitably there'll be people in that room who will probably have had abortions. That always happens.
Yep.
Sadly, the tragedy is that for many of those people, they would have felt they've never had the ability to talk about their abortion story in the church because of the silence around the
Yep.
issue. Because here's the thing, silence communicates something as well. And when we don't talk on abortion as a church, it makes those women and even those men who've maybe coerced women to have abortions, they feel massive guilt and maybe think, oh, that issue's too big for the gospel. There's these
Mm.
sins, but then there's that sin that I just, God's not deep down, there's that guilt and shame over it. But I often say, look, the gospel's
Yep.
big enough for the issue of abortion. Absolutely. There's no one out, there's nothing
Yep.
that's outside the grace of God. So I make that clear at the beginning of my talks always because I want people to sit
Hmm.
there to be educated, not to feel condemned. Romans 8:1 says,
Mm.
isn't it very clear? There's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And that includes the issue of abortion. Christ has paid our sin on the cross. And through repentance and faith in him, we
Mm.
have new life. We are new creations, which is incredible. So again, the gospel is absolutely pivotal to what I do. I'm unashamed of that. I think there has been this strategy where
Yep.
because we want to influence culture, we want to go, we want to influence the secularists. We want to be like, look, we're not really religious folk, but we're more like you. I'm not interested in that
Mm.
type of strategy.
Yep.
I'm interested in telling what's true, and oftentimes with
Yeah.
those secularists who wouldn't share my religious perspectives, it often actually creates a pathway to speaking about the gospel. So yeah, it's fun. Look,
Mm.
to cut it, it's fundamental to all I do.
Well, that's great because there is that pull too. I've worked in many Christian organizations and even Christian sponsorship, like child organizations, where they say, oh, constantly, oh, you should be changing your messaging so that
Mm,
you receive more secular support. And as soon as we do that, as soon as we take the gospel out, we just become powerless. Like we've lost the thought of who God is, of who our God that we're worshiping is, that he spoke the universe into existence. And yet we're trying to work without him. Like it's silly when we think of it in that sense.
absolutely.
And yeah,
It's a wrong understanding, Heather, as well
yeah.
of what secularism is. Uh, a lot of the error is that we think secularism is neutral in its ideology. It's not neutral.
Mm,
What it
yep,
wants to do is it wants the Christian to privatize their faith. It wants them to be quiet about their faith, and that's directly at odds with
yep.
a Christian ethic. Because again, in Matthew 5:13 to 16, Jesus tells us to be salt and light, to shine our light, to not hide it
Mm.
under a basket or a bushel. So the secular humanistic desire for us and that myth of neutrality is completely false.
I know I constantly have to remind myself with all these issues that I'm talking about. And when you're confronting people who disagree with you, is that we're in a spiritual battle. that these people are lost, that we're either following God or we're following Satan. We're in the darkness.
That's right.
And I was reading something the other day. It said that Satan is never more pro-choice when you're walking into an abortion clinic, and he's never more pro-life until you're walking out of the clinic. He deceives you to go and commit that sin, and then as soon as you've done that, he heaps the guilt on you, so that you're just lost in guilt. And it's just,
tragedy.
Realizing that he is the enemy here that we need to be fighting.
Yeah,
not people just by themselves.
Yeah.
Mm.
I totally agree.
So, yeah. I'd love to hear and to understand more about your work in your vision with your Be Equipped organization to educate and strengthen church leaders. What do you see? What does an equipped church and congregation look like, and how do they function?
That's a good question. I think to equip the saints is I think we need to enlarge on what our understanding of discipleship is in terms of how we equip the saints. And I think what happens is, at theological education, I teach there, I'm doing a PhD, so this is not a slant on that. But oftentimes when I have a lot of people who are going to be pastors who I teach, and I have a lot of people who are not. And one of the things with my topics, and this is a bit of a soapbox issue for me, especially Christian ethics, apologetics, worldview, for example, what tends to happen is my courses are generally optional. And one of the issues that you can have a pastor who can go and get theological education and actually for 3 years, 5 years do their education and never touch the issue of Christian ethics. And why that's problematic is because actually at a pastoral level, unlike probably the 1950s or 1940s when the culture was predominantly Christian, you would definitely have, maybe a lot of the touch points, points would be theological discussions. Are you a Calvinist? Are you an Arminian? That type of stuff.
Yep.
Whereas actually now, a lot of the touch points pastorally are ethical. You'll have a woman who would say, for example, my daughter wants to go and have an abortion, what should I do? Or my son has homosexual tendencies or leanings, what should I do? And again, tragically, if you've done your whole theological education and never touched those issues, what are you going to do? You're just going to be like that, unable to articulate and help these people navigate that complexity. So in terms of my heart, and I'm aware of that, and that's where I hopefully can come in and, with my ministry, just be a helpful tool or a resource in that area as well.
That's really helpful to think about. And maybe part of the trap that Christians fall into, I've certainly fallen into this trap, is that the gospel is sufficient, which it is, and scripture is sufficient, but teasing out these issues, what they mean, how do you respond to people specifically, needs to be done. Because like anything, I remember when I was listening to some reflections on after Charlie Kirk had been shot, and people were talking about his life. And there was one guy who was saying that he used to meet up with Charlie and they would go through questions they think campus students would say and think about responses to that. And I thought, wow, that's super interesting. I thought like Charlie Kirk was a brilliant mind. I thought he just fired these off his, mind just like that without any prep. And I was like, oh, wow, if Charlie Kirk needs to do that, then we all need to do that. Like thinking about how you're going to tease this issue out from a biblical perspective. And that's where your apologetics and ethics comes in. Yeah, that's really good to be doing with the church.
And I think as well, Heather, look, it's something that we should be excited about actually, because again, the church has answers for the culture, and we should be like, yeah, let's, like Charlie Kirk, even having these little church groups that, we tend to, because they can be so divisive, not talk about them. But if that is managed well, it can be very, very fruitful for your congregation and for our impact at large.
Yeah. And realizing that we have the truth, we have the answers to a lot of these people. There's certainly a group out there who are completely hostile, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to engage with. But for the majority of people are wrestling, they don't have the answers to life and death and what this means. And so we do. So to just engage with them and think, it's not going to we did have Charlie Kirk who was shot. So you think, that there is the possibility of that more so in the US. But for the majority of people who we're dealing with, they want to have conversations about this because they don't have any answers. So to be spurred on that we should be equipping ourselves to do this well, for sure.
And they found what's incredible, I think.
Mm.
I think the culture has been found wanting in terms of the
Mm.
answers that it's trying to give to these people, and it's been rejected. So
Yep.
there's a massive opportunity for the church now to go, you know what? We have the truth. Let's start speaking into it. And this is a lesson for myself and for everyone in this space, but is to be like, look, yeah, all those secular humanists, when I was at school, new atheism was big. All of it's been found bankrupt now, and people are searching and looking for
Yep.
some truth.
So how can people support your work and get involved? What is your call to action for the church and to Christians in Australia, specifically in Queensland where we are?
I think the first step is always to just on Cherish Life's website, which is www.cherishlife.org.au, is sign up to our newsletter list and find out what we're doing. We've got some exciting stuff coming up. We're on
Mhm.
Instagram, Facebook,
Mhm.
Twitter, all those social media accounts. Again, follow us, give us a follow. Again, if you're already there, we would not say no to any donations that would come our way. Again, we're battling a multi-billion-dollar industry here. We need all the help we
Yep.
can get. So that's another avenue if you want to
Yes,
become
for
a
sure.
supporter in that way. So
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Matt. It's been great to have a chat about all these issues with you.
thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.